Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, this is one that has also been recommended to me a lot this week. I'm taking a lot of your recommendations on what we're taking a look at. This is the unfair matches of the Roman Colosseum, brought to us by the channel Good Enough, which, by the way, has 926,000 subscribers. And so if you like what you see and you think this is the kind of channel you would love to support, then I would encourage you to click on the link down in the description. Go sign up as a subscriber on the channel and let's push them over 1 million and get them that gold play button. Would love to see that happen. Always love it when we have the opportunity to support the original content creators, to keep them doing what they're doing so that we can all learn history together. So I'm excited to dive into this one because this is a topic that I've been finding myself very interested in since my trip to Italy in April, where I got to visit the Colosseum, what we call the Colosseum. It wasn't really called that too much at the time. It was mostly known as the Flavian Amphitheater because it was built by the Flavian emperors, which kind of only ruled Rome for a very short time. And if you've seen the TV show that just came out, it's called Those About to Die. Then you know a little bit about the Flavian amphitheaters and about the story behind the building of the Colosseum. Colosseum was meant to be a small arena. I know we think of it as like this big deal, but it was actually meant to be more intimate and small and to get the crowd close to the action, because they already had the Circus Maximus, which, depending on the estimates you look at, could seat somewhere in the 250 to 300,000 people range. So this is like a fifth the size of that, the Colosseum, seating 50, 60,000. But it was meant to be that small, intimate as 50,000 people can be. And this is where you could do things that you couldn't do at a big arena like the Circus Maximus, which is actually really close to the Colosseum. So interested in what he has to say about these matches, and we'll give some more background and some more interesting tidbits where appropriate. Let's dive into this one. So I should mention, as we dive into this one, why it was called the Colosseum. Well, it actually had to do with a huge colossus, a statue that was on the site right next to where the Colosseum was built. It was a statue of Nero. It was like 100 and some feet tall, and maybe 90 feet. I don't know. It was around 100 feet tall, and it was a colossus. And so built next to it, that's how everybody kind of knew the spot, is because it was built next to that spot.
Let's start with the unfair and slowly work our way towards the most brutal matchups on the list. Number 10, blind fighters. Andebadia were criminals who would be forced to fight completely blind. They would be given a straight sword and a helmet for protection. Except the helmet was practically a curse, since it was completely sealed off, preventing the fighter from seeing or hearing anything. The fight would begin as soon as the fighters were placed within close range of one another, with the most popular strategy being the swing and pray method, which in all honesty was the only strategy available.
Really, yeah.
Now, the good news is that judges weren't really needed for these fights, since the winners were very easy to identify, as they were the only contestants still breathing. Now, the crazy part is that this spectacle was seen as comedic relief more than anything. And if you don't think two blind men fighting each other to the death is hilarious, well, you have a lot to learn about comedy.
So if you want a really good dive into the psyche behind all this and the reason behind all of it and why people were so into it, Dan Carlin just did a podcast, I don't know how long ago, about this on his podcast, Hardcore History. It's called Painfotainment. And he talks about some of the history of all this stuff and why it was that the Roman people would be so into this and not horrified by it. And a lot of it had to do how they viewed these people. And as he mentioned there, these are criminals. And so often in cases like this, for example, think about it in your own life. When you think about, okay, your next door neighbor who you're friends with, you wouldn't want to see them strapped to an electric chair and killed. That would be horrible. You'd be upset. It would probably make you sick to your stomach. But you can probably think of people that you wouldn't mind seeing in that situation. Maybe some horrible serial killer, a terrorist, or someone that has done awful, awful things. That's how they viewed this. They viewed this as these are people who are getting what's coming to them anyway. They don't really matter as human beings. So it became entertainment. And lest we think we wouldn't be interested in such things, look at what passes for entertainment for us. Even though it's fake on TV and movies, a lot of people get really into the gore and that kind of stuff. They didn't have that back then. All they had was the real thing.
Now, this might not sound that unfair at first, since both men are equally blind and equipped with the same weapon. But think again, since the winner of the match would typically be rewarded with another match, then another one, and another one, and another one. You get the point. As you can imagine, a winning streak never really lasted for very long. Number 9.
So that might be true in that case, but when we're talking about gladiators, very often gladiators would make a lot of money themselves, even though a lot of them were slaves, and they could get to the place where they could eventually buy their freedom or get to status where they were able to survive.
9. Naval battles. There was nothing more epic than the naval battles of the Colosseum. Also, one of the most unfair, bloody, and expensive. The event would begin by filling the Colosseum with water in around a dozen ships. It's estimated that thousands of prisoners would participate in these events. But let's talk about what made these battles unfair. Now,
so what's really cool about this is you go to the Colosseum today and you can actually see the remnants of the system they used to make this happen, the pumping system, and they estimate they could fill the Colosseum to about 4 to 5 feet of water in 20 minutes. It was a really impressive thing that they were able to do. It's just one of many things that when you go to Rome impresses you about some of the technology that the Roman Empire had.
Now, depending on the starting position of your ship, it could determine your likelihood of survival. Well, at least for a bit longer, as the odds of survival were almost non-existent to begin with. Ships that started in between two other ships would make for an easy target, easily creating a 1v2 scenario. Prisoners would invade other ships, killing everyone that stood in their way, while others would simply use the more popular strategy we see today, which is of course, running away from all fights and sneaking their way to the final round, where they can hope to steal the win with a single kill.
This is what I do when I play Fortnite, which I haven't played for a while. Is I just try to survive, let everybody kill each other, and then only fight when I absolutely have to. This would totally be my strategy.
The bloody fight would come to an end when there was only one ship or team remaining. As terrible as these battles were, at least they were easy to clean up. The Romans would try their best to remove all the large debris from the water, before the stadium would be flushed like a giant toilet bowl, sending all the remains downstream for another town to deal with. Number 8. Gladiator fights.
Yep.
Gladiator fights were the single most popular matches of the Colosseum.
It's important to note that they weren't the only fights in the Colosseum. That's the one that's iconic, and when anybody thinks of fights in the Colosseum, they think of gladiator fights. But they sometimes did weeks of games. And a typical day could have multiple different kinds of events, and hunts were very popular, where they would bring in these exotic animals and then people would hunt the animals. It wasn't just people killing people all the time.
With the good matchups typically being saved for the main event. Now, how can two gladiators fighting each other be unfair, you might ask? Well, for starters, the emperors weren't really interested in fairness, as their primary concern was entertainment.
Yep.
And with over 20 different classes of gladiators to choose from, the styles would be mixed and matched based on entertainment alone.
And there's betting going on, and so depending on the matchups, you want to do something that's going to get people to bet and to invest money. And the Colosseum's very much like a modern stadium. You can go out, and the Circus Maximus was the same way. You can go there today and you can see the stalls where the animals were kept. You can see the places where people went to use the bathroom. They had, latrines in this thing that people would go out and use. They had places that you could go and buy food, concession stands. I mean, it was so much like exactly what we have today.
Here are some of the most unfair and popular matchups. Retiarius versus Secutor. Retiarius were equipped with a net, a trident, a dagger, and minimal armor.
And this is one of the most common things you see portrayed in TV and movies when you show gladiator contests.
While the Secutor was equipped with a sword, a large shield, a helmet, and heavy armor. Go ahead, pick one. If you chose the Secutor, well, GG's, you're dead. As the Retiarius just had to keep his distance and poke at the Secutor. Or better yet, trap him by throwing his net on him, giving him enough time to emote before poking him to death. Alright, let's try another one. Murmillo versus Thorax. Murmillo were armed with a large rectangular shield, a short sword, a helmet, and a metal or leather sleeve for protection, while the Thorax was equipped with a light shield, a curved sword, a helmet, and a metal or leather sleeve for protection. Go ahead, pick one. If you chose the Murmillo, rip, you're dead, as the Thorax just had to tire out the Murmillo since he was carrying the heavier shield.
And I would guess in a lot of cases, if they were able to, they'd just toss the heavier shield, but then you have no shield.
As you can see, stylistic matchups were a big deal.
Yep.
It could easily influence the outcome of a fight. And I know this might come as a shock to some, but not all gladiator fights were to the death. A lot of fights would be called off when a fighter took heavy damage, since good gladiators were very expensive to replace. Number 7.
Yeah, that's something people don't think about, is that these gladiator contests, they went on in a lot of places. You had the minor leagues, basically. Every Roman town of any size had this kind of stuff. You go to Pompeii. Pompeii had a similar stadium to the Colosseum. It actually dates back about 150 years before the Colosseum was built. And it's seated, I think, around 10,000. They still do concerts there today. And it's pretty well preserved. So it was on a smaller stage. But if guys were really good at those stages, they might find themselves taken to the Colosseum for the big matches when that time in history came. And it was an investment, and you wanted these guys to be able to continue providing entertainment. And so if they get killed, they're no longer providing entertainment, they're no longer making money.
Animal battles. Humans were not the only ones to have unfair matchups inside of the Colosseum, since animals were also treated like criminals. They would be enslaved, pinned against each other, and humiliated.
And one of the things about the Roman Empire spreading out to more exotic and remote locations is that they're able to bring animals that people in Rome have never seen before. And that would be particularly fascinating to them to see how they performed against other animals.
And were such a popular spectacle that at times, thousands of animals would be slaughtered in a given day, which was completely unsustainable, driving many animals to extinction. Here are some of the most popular and unfair matchups that were commonly seen in the Colosseum. Elephant versus rhino.
Rhino would destroy an elephant. Rhino is one of the deadliest animals on Earth. Actually, no, I'm thinking of hippos. Hippos are, I think, one of the deadliest animals on Earth.
One of the most famous Colosseum battles was when an enraged rhino was pinned against an elephant, with the elephant eventually winning when he decided to cheat by grabbing a spear with its trunk and gouging the rhino's eyes out.
What?
Lion versus tiger.
Oh, tiger would destroy a lion.
This matchup is basically a robbery, as I'm sure the locals would have bet large amounts of money against the guys from out of town, since they knew that the lion always wins, with there only being...
I'm not sure he's right about that. All right, so I did a little digging, and then I actually went to the comment section of this video, and I found out that, yeah, he actually corrected himself on that one. The tiger, if you just think about it logically, tigers are much stronger. They're typically much bigger, and lions tend to attack in packs, whereas tigers are good solo fighters. So I think he meant to say tigers.
One recorded incident of a tiger getting the best of a lion. Elephant versus bull. As you can imagine, when an animal has over 10,000 pounds on its opponent, it's not really going to be much of a fight, is it? But just to make matters worse, sometimes the elephant and the bull would be chained together, forcing the action. And no matter how the fight begins, it would always end with the bull being turned to soup. Really quickly, here are some of the other animal fights that were very popular. Rhino versus bear, rhino versus buffalo, rhino versus elephant.
Basically what they're doing is they're playing Ultimate Epic Battle Simulator. If you've ever played that game where you can kind of basically match up anything you want with each other, that's what they're doing here.
Crocodile versus hippo, tiger versus bear, bear versus bull, bear versus wolves, goro versus scorpion, lion versus bull, lion versus bear, lion versus panther, lion versus chimp, lion versus hyenas, lion versus basically any animal the Romans can get a hold of. Number 6, 1 versus 2.
Yeah.
This matchup can be unfair for either side depending on the circumstances. Let me explain. There are 2 scenarios in which this matchup can take shape. 1. A high-level gladiator will take on 2 prisoners simultaneously, and as the prisoners try their best to figure out how to properly hold a sword, they will realize that it's very difficult to do so, since their hands are no longer attached. Now, the second scenario is a bit more fair. 3 well-trained gladiators were placed inside of the Colosseum. One gladiator would be given heavy armor and a good weapon, while his 2 opponents would receive minimal armor and worse weapons.
Basically, this is all like a social experiment to see, somebody sitting around a room thinking, I wonder what would happen if 2 lightly armed, minimally armored guys went up against a heavily armored guy. Who would win? You know what? Let's find out.
Duo would need to work together to defeat the better equipped man, but being partnered up is not as easy as you might think, and does come with its own set of challenges, like knowing whether you should go for the res or attempt to clutch up when your partner inevitably goes down. The last and final way that a gladiator can be outnumbered is during large-scale battles. This one is, of course, purely based on luck alone, and doesn't always mean that you will see a 1v2 matchup, as it just might be a 1v6 depending on how bad your team is.
Right, and you also have situations, and maybe he'll talk about this, where they want to recreate famous battles. You see that in the movie Gladiator, where they're like, we're going to recreate, a battle between Scipio Africanus and Hannibal, for example. Obviously it's set up to be a certain way, and it's, just, again, for entertainment value.
Number 5, woman versus dwarf. Emperor Domitian introduced the legend.
Domitian was particularly psycho. He's portrayed in that new show, Those About to Die. He's the last of the 3 Flavian emperors. You've got his brother Titus, who was briefly emperor before him, and Titus was actually the one who had conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 70 AD, and then he's the one that finishes the Colosseum, and then he's only he's only emperor for like 2 years, and then Domitian takes over. Domitian eventually is murdered and replaced, and that's when you have the next dynasty come in.
Legendary matchup, woman versus dwarf. And I have to admit, this is the only battle on the list where a clear winner was not well documented. But even with the little information we do have, I have a gut feeling that it just wasn't a fair matchup. I'm just not certain for whom. You see, on one hand, you have a fully grown woman who obviously has the reach advantage, while on the other hand, you have a male dwarf who is much stronger and obviously uses magic. How much stronger? Well, I'm not sure. I did, however, stumble upon this forum where a guy asked the same question back in 2011. Now, sadly, people just replied back with even more interesting questions that we will never get the answers to. And of course, naturally, the entire forum devolved into guys just bragging about how many dwarves they can take on at once.
Oh my gosh.
One of the most bizarre things about this matchup was that Emperor Domitian liked to schedule this fight at night, since he preferred this battle when it was illuminated by torchlights. In 2010, a female gladiator's remains were found in England.
Wow.
After they were examined.
See, there you go, England. So you've got gladiators in England. I mean, anywhere that the Roman Empire touched, they brought their culture with them.
It was concluded that the woman's legs and arm bones were unusually heavy, suggesting that she had strong muscles. I was originally leaning towards the dwarf, but now I really don't see how they could possibly win. Number 4, wild animal hunts. Perhaps one of the most unique spectacles of the Colosseum was
not only one of the most unique, but one of the most popular and one of the most common.
Wild animal hunts. Here, the entire Colosseum arena was made to resemble the animal's natural environment. A few men were then brought out to the arena equipped with small shields and weapons. Then for the next few minutes or hours, the arena would be slowly filled with terrifying predators. But if they really wanted to get the crowd on their feet, all the animals would be released at once. Sometimes the men who were fighting the lions, bears, and panthers would have been well-trained fighters, while others...
I'm just curious. I want to do a little social experiment of my own, because I found myself, as they're talking about that, creating the atmosphere by making it look like a thing. And this is, if you've ever been to like a Broadway show or the West End, you know how really creative people can get, even in a small space, to really make something come alive. They did the same thing 2,000 years ago. But releasing people in and then releasing all these wild animals and seeing how it all shapes out. I found myself curious what that would have been like. And so my social experiment is this. I'm curious to know if at any point during all of this that's being portrayed, did you find yourself thinking, yeah, you know what? I actually kind of would have liked to seen that. That would have been interesting to watch. If that's you, let me know in the comment section below.
Other times, they would have been condemned criminals who were just given the death sentence and stood 0 to no chance of winning. Here are some of the animals you could have expected to make an appearance. Lions, tigers, bears, elephants, rhinos, panthers, leopards, hyenas, wolves, boars, bulls, deers, ostriches, crocodiles, giraffes, camels, and shiprats. Of course, shiprats were not invited, but they showed up anyways. Number 3.
Makes sense.
Man versus Beast. Man vs. Beast matches were one-on-one battles and were the second most popular spectacle, only behind gladiator fights. Now, there were basically 2 ways that this matchup would be arranged, with both of them tailored for maximum entertainment for the crowd. The first one was when a professional slave or volunteer fighter known as a bestiarius would face off with a terrifying beast. The animal could be anything from a lion, leopard, tiger, bear, or any other large and powerful creature. These battles would typically end with the animal being defeated, even if the bestiarius took heavy damage. On the other hand, the second matchup was much more bloody and typically ended with the man being torn to pieces. Here, a criminal or prisoner of war would be forced to face off with the animal. With little to no training, it was only a matter of time before the man would become an anatomy lesson.
And they would also do just legit executions where the people didn't fight back. You know, people often think of, like throwing Christians to the lions. And while that wasn't nearly as common as I think some people think it was, it only really happened under a couple of emperors. I think Domitian being one of them. But Diocletian was the one who really took this to another level. Nero, of course, Nero didn't have the Colosseum. He had the Circus Maximus, and he would sometimes do this, but more often than not with Christians, what Nero would do would basically do things like turn them into human torches and have them as the light for his dinner party. He didn't typically do it just as entertainment for the crowds. But sometimes they would just throw people out there just as to be executed.
And it definitely didn't help that the animals were starved for long periods of time before they were brought out, making them a lot more angry and aggressive. There was even a single lion that took out over 200 men before it was finally defeated.
Wow.
Which is obviously a padded record, since it clearly fought nothing but tomato cans.
And again, why is this all known to us? Because we are so privileged that we have a lot of documentation, because a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but enough significant sources of people writing this stuff down from the time period that survived to this day. And unfortunately, there were people who were writing down similar things in other cultures, but those things didn't survive for one reason or another, so we don't have as much record.
Oh, I should also mention, there is another event that was very popular and is somewhat related, where a criminal was tied to a stake and then a wild animal would be released to eat him alive.
There you go.
You know, you would think that this would be one of those situations where if you've seen it once, then you've seen them all type of deal. But apparently, some emperors love to show this one quite often. Number 2.
But that's also why they would mix it up and do different combinations of things.
Prisoner versus professional gladiator. Easily one of the most unfair matchups of the Colosseum was when prisoners would face off against a professional and seasoned gladiator. The professional gladiator could have been a slave himself with many fights under his belt, or a volunteer gladiator that was part of one of the many gladiatorial schools. Either way, the criminal with 0 to no experience was basically sentenced to death. You see, what could be worse than being invaded, enslaved, and kept inside of a cell for days, just to be given a weapon you have never used, then pushed to the center of the Colosseum floor, only for Spartacus to make his walkout shortly after you. Number 1. Rigged fights. What could be more unfair than rigged matches?
This is what you see fictionalized in Gladiator at the end when you see Commodus fights against Maximus, but he first stabs him in the side so that he's very weak.
Emperor Commodus was definitely the worst offender when it came to rigged matches. The emperor ruled Rome from 180 to 192 AD and was even portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix in the 2000 film Gladiator. Commodus was obsessed with becoming a famous and well-respected gladiator. So
I love the image here because
Commodus was,
you see how the hair goes all the way around like that. That's actually, if you see the sculptures of Commodus, that's exactly what he looked like. I mean, he didn't look like that with the eyes and the face and stuff, but look at an image of, you know what, I'm going to pull one up. There you go. So that's what I'm talking about. You know, he's got the hair and then the beard kind of going around there, and interesting image of him. And again, another thing that we have a lot of are these busts of these different emperors and different historic figures. But they weren't white like this. When they were made, they were very often painted so that they looked very lifelike and very realistic.
Was obsessed with becoming a famous and well-respected gladiator, so much so that he would even compete himself. Well, if you could even call it that. An emperor fighting as a gladiator was unheard of. Now, of course, Commodus had the best training in all of Rome and was actually very talented with the sword, but that wouldn't stop him from rigging fights by secretly injuring men just moments before they were brought out to face him. His opponents were injured in a way that could be concealed under their armor, but be devastating enough to hinder their performance or make a limb unusable.
Now, of course, historically, it didn't happen the way it did in Gladiator. He wasn't killed by a general turned into a slave. He was actually strangled, I think, in his bathtub by a wrestler. And then the Praetorian Guard auctioned off the role of emperor to the highest bidder.
Another strategy that the emperor would use was simply fighting men with 0 to no experience, making for another easy W. Emperor Commodus would have the longest undefeated record as a gladiator, and it's suspected that he competed hundreds of times. He would also charge the Roman treasury around 25,000 pieces of silver every time he competed. There are many things you could call Emperor Commodus, but one thing you can't say is that he ever discriminated, since animals were also injured and thrown in to face him. Apparently, he killed hundreds of lions, ostriches, some giraffes, and on one occasion even killed 3 elephants that were just laying on the floor. Now, as horrible as this all sounds, this was all just a warm-up, and in November of 192 AD, he held the Polybian Games, a festival that lasted around 2 weeks. There, Commodus shot hundreds of animals with arrows and javelins every single day. But if it makes you feel any better, 1 month after the Polybian Games, Commodus would be strangled to death inside of his bathtub by a professional wrestler named Narcissus. Which, for a man, that has to be the most embarrassing way to be found dead. Completely naked inside of a cold tub. You can't even explain your way out of that one.
Oh, that was good. That was really interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we'll see you again soon with another video. Thanks for watching.